The cold Chicago rain streaks down the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Onyx Tower, blurring the city's glittering lights into a watercolor painting of wealth and isolation. Inside the lobby, the world is silent, sterile, and imposing. Polished black marble floors reflect the abstract, million-dollar art pieces like a dark, still lake, and the only sounds are the quiet hum of a state-of-the-art ventilation system and the faint, melancholic notes of a distant piano sonata. In the center of this cathedral of opulence stand Officer Frank Miller and his partner, their dark blue Chicago PD uniforms a stark, working-class intrusion. They've responded to a penthouse noise complaint, a call that feels less like law enforcement and more like trespassing. The air, heavy with the scent of expensive leather and a faint floral fragrance, crackles with an unspoken hierarchy, making Miller's standard-issue ballistic vest feel unusually heavy on his chest. The elevator chimes, a soft, melodic tone that announces the arrival of the building's king. Richard Sterling emerges, not with a storm of anger, but with a chilling, arrogant calm. He's dressed in an unbuttoned, custom-tailored shirt and a silk smoking jacket, his silver hair perfectly swept back, his face a mask of bored contempt. He glides across the marble, his expensive slippers making no sound, and stops a calculated distance from the officers, his posture radiating an untouchable authority. His eyes, cold and dismissive, scan Miller from head to toe, lingering on the badge and the worn leather of his duty belt with a palpable disdain. Sterling doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. His very presence is a declaration of power, a silent message that he is the law here, and these men are merely temporary, unpleasant insects in his gilded cage. A noise complaint? Sterling's voice is a low, cutting drawl, each word sharpened to inflict maximum condescension. He lets out a short, humorless laugh. My time, officers, is valued at more per minute than your entire monthly salary. So please, state your business and get out of my building. Miller, his face a neutral mask honed by a decade of de-escalating tense situations, begins to calmly explain the protocol. Sir, we've had multiple calls, but Sterling raises a hand, a gesture of absolute finality, cutting him off mid-sentence. He glances over at Carlos, the uniformed doorman standing ramrod straight by the entrance, a silent witness to the unfolding humiliation. I employ people to handle minor annoyances, Sterling says, his gaze still fixed on Miller, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He lets the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final, crushing blow. I have doorman for a reason, he sneers, his voice dripping with venom. You're just one in a different uniform. The words echo in the cavernous lobby, a deliberate, public emasculation. The insult strikes a deeper chord than Sterling could ever imagine, digging into the heart of Miller's identity and the quiet dignity his father, a hotel doorman for 30 years, had instilled in him. But as the sting of humiliation washes over him, a detail catches Miller's eye. Just past Sterling's shoulder on a sleek mahogany console table lies a commercial shipping manifest. Its technical jargon lists of industrial-grade art preservation chemicals is glaringly out of place in a residential penthouse. In that instant, the personal insult fades behind a professional instinct. A single, dangerous loose thread has just appeared in Richard Sterling's meticulously woven tapestry of power. The seed of suspicion has been planted in the most humiliating way. Will Officer Miller let this insult slide, or will he pull at that loose thread and unravel a much darker secret? If you want to see how this story unfolds, subscribe to our channel and comment where you're watching from, so we know how far this story of justice is reaching. The drive home from the precinct was a blur of rain-slicked streets and neon signs bleeding into one another. Officer Frank Miller kept the cruiser's radio silent, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Richard Sterling's words echoed in the quiet confines of the car, replaying on a relentless loop. You're just one in a different uniform. Each syllable was a fresh sting, a calculated jab at a vulnerability Miller rarely acknowledged. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the insult burrowing deeper than any physical threat he had ever faced on the job. It wasn't just about his badge. It was about his father, A man who had worn a doorman's uniform for 3 decades with a quiet, unshakable dignity that Sterling could never comprehend. He remembered his father, Michael Miller, coming home late at night, his feet aching but his smile genuine. He'd taught Frank that there was no shame in service, only in arrogance. He taught him to see the people others looked through, the janitors, the valets, the doormen. They were the invisible architecture of society, the ones who held the doors open for men like Sterling. The insult felt like a desecration of that memory, a stain on his father's legacy of quiet honor. Sterling hadn't just humiliated a police officer. He had mocked the very principle his father lived by. Frank felt a cold, righteous anger begin to solidify in his gut, a feeling far more potent and dangerous than simple bruised pride. It was an anger that demanded not revenge, but a reckoning. Unlocking the door to his modest 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood worlds away from the Onyx Tower, the contrast was almost laughable. Here, the walls were thin, the paint was peeling slightly near the window frame, and the furniture was functional, not decorative. It was a life built on a civil servant's salary, a world of careful budgets and quiet contentment. As he sank into his worn armchair, the opulence of Sterling's lobby, the silent marble, the abstract art, the sheer scale of the wealth felt like a scene from another planet. The disparity wasn't just financial. It was a chasm in values. Sterling lived in a world where respect was a commodity to be bought and power was a weapon to be wielded, while Frank lived in a world where respect was earned through integrity. Sleep offered no escape that night. Every time Frank closed his eyes, he saw Sterling's sneering face, but then the image would dissolve into the cryptic text of the shipping manifest. Industrial-grade art preservation chemicals. Why would a man living in a penthouse need commercial quantities of such a thing? It was a discordant note in Sterling's symphony of perfection, a detail that didn't fit. His cop's brain, trained to look for patterns and anomalies, couldn't let it go. It was the kind of detail that could be nothing, a simple explanation waiting in the wings. Or it could be the tip of an iceberg, a small clue hinting at a much larger, uglier truth hidden beneath the polished surface of Sterling's life. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke through his window, a decision had been made. This was no longer just about a personal slight. The insult had opened a door, and his gut, the instinct he'd learned to trust over 10 years on the street, was telling him to walk through it. He knew the risks. Poking into the life of a man as wealthy and connected as Richard Sterling was professional suicide for a beat cop. He would be overstepping his duties, inviting scrutiny, and risking reprimand. But the image of his father's tired, proud face, combined with the nagging puzzle of the manifest, created a resolve that was stronger than his fear. He would start digging quietly, on his own time. The next afternoon, during a lull at the end of his shift, Frank sat at a shared precinct computer, the clatter of keyboards and the buzz of official chatter, a familiar backdrop. He typed Richard Sterling's name into the internal database, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. He felt like a trespasser, stepping into a world where he didn't belong. The initial search results were predictable. A few speeding tickets handled by expensive lawyers, a minor civic dispute that disappeared from the record, and a slew of articles detailing his ruthless business acquisitions. He was a ghost in the system, his wealth a powerful shield that deflected any real scrutiny. But Frank wasn't looking for the obvious. He started digging into property records, a tedious but often revealing process. He searched for the Onyx Tower and found it was owned not by Sterling directly, but by a limited liability company, Onyx Holdings LLC, that was standard practice for the wealthy. But then he cross-referenced the LLC's registration documents. The chain of ownership was a tangled web, a series of other LLCs, each one a shell designed to obscure the true owner. It was a deliberate, complex maze of corporate structuring. Sterling's arrogant boast from the lobby, "My building," wasn't just a figure of speech. He had literally built a fortress of legal entities around himself, making him almost untouchable. The complexity of the financial structures was dizzying, far beyond the scope of a patrol officer's usual work. Frank stared at the screen, at names like Sterling Capital Ventures, Midwest Luxury Properties, and Lakeshore Asset Management, all interconnected in a way that felt intentionally confusing. He felt a surge of doubt. What was he even looking for? He was a cop who dealt with domestic disputes and petty theft, not corporate espionage. He was out of his depth, a minnow swimming in a shark tank. The sheer scale of Sterling's financial empire was designed to intimidate, to make anyone who dared to look closer feel small and powerless. And it was working. Just as he was about to give up for the day, he found it. A tiny digital footnote buried in the records of a defunct subsidiary LLC that had once been part of the Onyx Holdings portfolio. It was a red flag for a minor financial irregularity, a transaction that had been flagged by a bank's automated system a few years ago. The issue had been quickly resolved. The inquiry dropped after a team of Sterling's lawyers descended. It was nothing, a blip on the radar. But to Frank, it was confirmation. It was the first small crack in the marble facade. It proved that for a brief moment, someone else had thought that something was wrong. He wasn't just chasing a ghost fueled by a bruised ego. Armed with this sliver of validation, Frank knew his next step was the riskiest yet. He couldn't rely on digital records alone. He needed a human source. He needed to talk to Carlos, the doorman. The thought of returning to the Onyx Tower filled him with a cold dread. He could picture the scene vividly, Sterling appearing again, the public humiliation repeated, this time with professional consequences. He would be accused of harassment, and his career would be over. For 2 days, he debated with himself, the fear of failure warring with the pull of his instinct. But every time he decided to let it go, he saw his father's face, and he knew he couldn't. He had to honor that legacy. He chose a Tuesday afternoon, during a shift change, when the lobby would be busy and his presence less conspicuous. He wore civilian clothes, a simple jacket and jeans, hoping to blend in. He saw Carlos standing near the main entrance, his posture as rigid and professional as it had been the other night. Frank approached cautiously, his hands feeling clammy. "Carlos," he said, his voice quiet. The doorman turned, his face betraying a flicker of recognition, then immediately settling into a polite, impenetrable mask. "Can I help you, sir?" The "sir" was professional, but it was also a wall. Carlos was on duty, and he wasn't going to risk his job for a stranger. Frank fumbled for the right words, realizing a direct approach would fail. "My name is Frank Miller. We met the other night." Carlos nodded stiffly, his eyes darting around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable. "I remember." Frank took a breath and decided to take a gamble on the truth, or at least a part of it. "Look, this might sound strange," he began, "but my father, he was a doorman for 30 years. At the Drake Hotel, he saw a subtle shift in Carlos's expression. The professional mask wavered for just a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity. He had created a small connection, a bridge between two worlds. He loved that job, Frank continued, his voice softer now. He used to say you see the whole world through one door. You see people at their best and their worst. Carlos's gaze softened. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He was right, Carlos said, his voice barely a whisper. You see everything. In that moment, they were no longer a cop and a potential witness. They were the sons of the service industry, two men who understood the quiet dignity and the silent burdens of a life spent being invisible to the powerful. The wall between them had not crumbled, but a small gate had just been unlocked. A few days later, Frank returned, this time with 2 coffees in a cardboard holder. He found Carlos on a short break just outside the building's service entrance. He offered one to the doorman, who accepted with a surprised but grateful look. They stood in the chilly Chicago air, sipping the hot coffee, not saying much at first. They talked about the weather, about the Cubs, about anything other than Richard Sterling. Frank was patient, letting the silence work, building a foundation of simple human interaction. He was showing Carlos that he saw him not as a source, but as a person, a courtesy he suspected Carlos was rarely afforded by the residents of the Onyx Tower. Slowly, tentatively, Carlos began to talk. He spoke of the long hours, the constant pressure to be perfect, the way the wealthy residents looked right through him as if he were part of the furniture. He had a wife and 2 daughters, and he worked a second job on weekends as a security guard to make ends meet. His life was a universe away from the casual, thoughtless wealth he witnessed every day. He wasn't bitter, but there was a deep weariness in his eyes, the fatigue of a man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family while being treated as less than human by the very people he served. Frank listened, nodding, sharing a story about how his own father used to soak his feet in hot water every night after a double shift. The shared experience created an unspoken bond. Finally, Frank gently steered the conversation. "That night, with Mr. Sterling," he said. "He seems like a difficult man to work for." Carlos looked down at his shoes, then out at the street. He was silent for a long time. "Difficult is one word for it," he finally said, his voice low. "He thinks he owns the world. He thinks the rules don't apply to him." The moment of truth had arrived. Frank could feel the delicate balance of trust he had built. He decided to be direct. "I'm looking into him, Carlos. Officially. I think he's involved in something illegal. I saw a shipping manifest in his apartment that didn't make sense." He watched Carlos's face, searching for any sign of retreat. Instead, the doorman's expression hardened with a quiet resolve. "You're right," Carlos whispered, his eyes scanning the street nervously. "There are things that don't make sense here. Things I see." "Like what?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice even, to hide the jolt of adrenaline that shot through him. Carlos took a deep breath, the confession seeming to weigh heavily on him. "Late nights," he said. "Once or twice a month, always after AM an armored car. No markings. It doesn't come to the front. It goes to the private loading bay. The security logs are always wiped the next morning." This was it. This was more than a hunch. This was a pattern. This was evidence. The risk Carlos was taking was immense. If Sterling found out he had spoken to a cop, he would not only be fired. A man with Sterling's resources could make his life a living hell, ensuring he never worked in the city again. Frank looked at this quiet, hard-working man, who was willing to risk his family's livelihood for a stranger, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Can you get me anything?" Frank asked softly. "A license plate number? Anything?" Carlos nodded. "I'll try," he said. "But you have to be careful. This man, he is dangerous." A week later, a folded piece of paper appeared in the mailbox at Frank's apartment. Inside was a single, handwritten license plate number. There was no note, no signature. But Frank knew it was from Carlos. He felt a profound sense of gratitude and a heavy weight of responsibility. Carlos had put his faith in him, had handed him a key. Now it was up to Frank to unlock the door. The bond between them, forged in shared experience and quiet defiance, had transformed this from a personal quest into a shared mission for justice. With the license plate number, Frank knew he could no longer work in the shadows. He had a tangible lead that had to be entered into the official record. He typed up a preliminary report detailing the initial noise complaint, the manifest, the suspicious corporate structure, and the anonymous tip about the armored car. He submitted it to his direct superior, Sergeant Davison, a 20-year veteran with a deep-seated cynicism and a firm belief in not rocking the boat. Davison read the report, his expression growing more and more concerned. Davison called Frank into his office and closed the door. "What is this, Miller?" he asked, tapping the report. "Are you out of your mind? Richard Sterling, you want to poke that bear?" He explained, in no uncertain terms, the political reality. Sterling was a major donor to the Police Benevolent Fund. He played golf with the deputy chief. His lawyers were the most ruthless in the city. "This looks like a personal vendetta over a rich guy hurting your feelings," Davison warned. "Drop it. For your own good." The sergeant's words were a bucket of ice water. He was right about the risks. If Frank pushed this and came up with nothing, he wouldn't just be reprimanded. He'd be a pariah. Sterling would sue him for harassment, and the department would hang him out to dry to protect itself. His ambition of ever-making detective would be gone. He'd be lucky to keep his job. He went home that night with the sergeant's warning echoing in his ears. The fear was real now, a cold knot in his stomach. Was this worth his entire career? But then he thought of Carlos, of the risk he had taken to get that license plate number. He thought of the quiet dignity in the man's eyes. If Carlos, with so much to lose, could be brave, how could he, a police officer sworn to uphold the law, back down? He owed it to Carlos, and to the memory of his father, to see this through. The next morning, he bypassed Sergeant Davison. He printed a new copy of his report, marked it for the attention of the Financial Crimes Unit, and submitted it through official interdepartmental channels. It was his moment of no return. He had crossed the Rubicon. Weeks bled into a month. The silence from the Financial Crimes Unit was deafening. Every day, Frank went out on patrol, handling the usual calls, the rhythm of the street a welcome distraction from the gnawing anxiety in his gut. He started to think Davison was right, that his report had been quietly buried in a mountain of paperwork, dismissed as the fantasy of an overzealous beat cop. He felt foolish and exposed. He avoided the Onyx Tower on his patrol route, worried that any contact with Carlos could endanger the doorman if Sterling was somehow watching him. He was completely isolated, alone with his risky decision. Then, one Tuesday morning, his phone rang. It was an internal precinct number he didn't recognize. Officer Miller, a gruff voice on the other end said, "This is Detective Evans, Financial Crimes. I've got your report here. I have a few questions." Relief washed over Frank, so potent it almost made him dizzy. It hadn't been buried. Someone was looking at it. They scheduled a meeting for the following day. The hope was quickly tempered by a new wave of anxiety. Now he had to defend his hunch to a seasoned detective who likely ate cops like him for breakfast. The meeting with Detective Evans was exactly as intimidating as Frank had imagined. Evans was a rumpled, cynical man in his late 50s, his desk a chaotic landscape of cold coffee cups and overflowing case files. He didn't offer Frank a seat. He just stared at him from across the desk, tapping the report with a pen. "This is Thin, patrolman," Evans said, his voice flat. "An anonymous tip, a weird manifest, and some perfectly legal LLCs. You got your feelings hurt by a rich jerk, so you decided to build a conspiracy theory. Is that about the size of it?" Frank felt a flush of anger, but forced it down. He had to be professional. He had to be convincing. He stood straight and met the detective's weary gaze. "With all due respect, Detective," Frank said, his voice steady, "it's not about my feelings. It's about the details that don't add up. The chemicals on that manifest are precursors for treating currency to avoid detection. The license plate number I was given belongs to a transport company with known ties to organized crime. And the shell companies are designed for one purpose, layering and hiding the source of funds." Evans stopped tapping his pen. He leaned back in his chair, studying Frank with a newfound, albeit grudging, respect. He had expected a hot-headed patrolman on a crusade. Instead, he got a calm, methodical presentation of facts. Frank wasn't emotional. He was logical. He laid out the connections he had made, the quiet work he had done on his own time. He wasn't just a beat cop with a grudge. He was a good cop with a solid instinct. The detective was silent for a full minute, the only sound the hum of the office's fluorescent lights. Finally, Evans sighed, a long, weary sound. "All right, Miller," he said. "I'm not making any promises, but I'll run the plate. I'll check out the transport company. If it's a dead end, this whole thing goes away, and you never mention Richard Sterling's name in this building again. We clear?" Frank nodded. "Crystal clear, Detective." He left the office feeling like he had just survived a parole hearing. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had passed the first test. Now all he could do was wait. The waiting was excruciating. Every day that passed without a call from Evans felt like a confirmation of his failure. He went through the motions of his job, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly replaying the conversation, second-guessing every word he had said. He worried about Carlos, hoping his own investigation hadn't inadvertently put the man in danger. He felt the crushing weight of his decision, the possibility that he had thrown away his career for nothing more than a wild goose chase. He was on an island, and the tide was rising. 2 weeks later, his phone rang. It was Evans. "Miller," the detective's gruff voice said, without any preamble. You were right. Frank's heart leaped into his throat. The transport company, Evans continued, a new energy in his voice. It's a known front for the Acosta cartel. We've been trying to get a solid link to their money laundering operations for years, but they're slippery. Your tip just connected them to a high-profile target. This is big. The validation was overwhelming. He wasn't crazy. His instincts had been spot on. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. Frank was no longer a supplicant. He was a collaborator. Evans asked him to come in, and this time he was offered a seat. The desk was still a mess, but the atmosphere was different. It was a partnership. Evans had pulled the preliminary shipping logs for Sterling's shell companies, and together they started to piece together the puzzle. The art being shipped was consistently overvalued, a classic trade-based money laundering scheme. The chemicals on the manifest were the final, damning piece of the puzzle. They worked late into the night, the precinct office emptying out around them, until it was just the two of them under the harsh fluorescent lights, fueled by stale coffee and the thrill of the chase. They mapped out the network on a large whiteboard, drawing lines between Sterling's LLCs, the transport company, and known cartel associates. It was becoming clear that the Onyx Tower wasn't just Sterling's home. It was the central hub of a massive, sophisticated operation. The apartments themselves were being used as shell corporations, their ownership transferred through layers of companies to wash illicit funds. The scale of the operation was staggering, far larger than either of them had anticipated. They were looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in laundered money flowing from international drug trafficking through the polished marble lobby of Chicago's most exclusive address. Evans, the jaded, cynical detective, was now fully invested, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of a career-defining case. He realized they were onto something that went beyond local financial crime. This had federal and international implications. "We're out of our depth here, kid," Evans admitted, staring at the complex web on the whiteboard. "This is U.S. Attorney territory. We need federal resources if we're going to take this down." He made a call, leveraging a contact he had at the federal building. He pitched the case, emphasizing the cartel connection and the scale of the laundering. The apathetic, bureaucratic machine that had ignored Frank's initial report was now kicking into high gear with astonishing speed. A meeting was scheduled for the next morning. They met with Assistant U.S. Attorney, a sharp, ambitious prosecutor named Elena Rojas. She listened intently as Evans laid out the case, with Frank providing the crucial details of the initial encounter and his subsequent investigation. Rojas saw the bigger picture immediately. She recognized the classic patterns of trade-based money laundering and layering, and she understood the potential for a massive RICO racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's charge. A RICO case would allow them to seize not just Sterling's assets, but the entire building as an instrument of a criminal enterprise. Rojas was impressed by Frank's initiative. "So this all started because a patrol officer paid attention to a detail that felt wrong," she said, looking directly at Frank. "Good work, Officer Miller." It was the first time in his career that his work had been acknowledged by someone at that level. He felt a surge of pride that was a world away from the humiliation he had felt in Sterling's lobby. Rojas officially sanctioned a joint task force, bringing in the FBI and the IRS. She made it clear that Frank was to be a part of it. Suddenly, Frank was taken off patrol duty and given a temporary desk in the bustling task force office. He was surrounded by seasoned federal agents and brilliant financial analysts. It was a dizzying transition. He was no longer just a beat cop. He was a key player in one of the biggest financial crime investigations in the city's recent history. The promotion to detective he had dreamed of felt closer than ever, but the pressure was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The stakes were no longer just about his career. They were about bringing down a powerful criminal empire. The task force set up a discreet surveillance operation on the Onyx Tower. From a nondescript van parked across the street, Frank spent hours watching the comings and goings, his patrolman's eye for street-level detail proving invaluable. He observed the patterns Carlos had described, logging the arrival of the unmarked armored car, tracking the movements of Sterling's known associates. He felt a strange sense of ownership over the case, a quiet determination to see it through to the end for the man who had trusted him. From his vantage point, he watched Richard Sterling live his life, completely oblivious to the net that was closing in around him. He saw him leaving in chauffeured cars, attending lavish parties, and treating his staff with the same casual disdain he had shown Frank. Sterling's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He was so insulated by his wealth, so convinced of his own superiority, that he couldn't conceive of a world where a lowly patrol officer could be a threat. He moved through his life with a carelessness that was breathtaking, a hubris that was leading him straight to his own destruction. One evening, the surveillance operation had a close call. A member of Sterling's private security detail, a former cop with a sharp eye, grew suspicious of their van. He approached, his hand resting on his sidearm. Frank, drawing on his 10 years of de-escalation training, met him at the door. He used a plausible cover story about watching a cheating spouse in a nearby building, his calm demeanor and familiar cop-to-cop banter diffusing the situation. The security guard eventually walked away, satisfied. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, how precarious their entire investigation was. The breakthrough they needed came from a court-authorized wiretap on Sterling's phone. For weeks, they listened to him conduct his legitimate business, his conversations guarded and professional. Then, one night, he got careless. Believing he was speaking on a secure line to an associate in Colombia, he discussed a shipment. He complained about the rising cost of the preservation chemicals and casually referred to the artwork as being heavy with memories. It was the final, undeniable piece of evidence they needed to link him directly to the cash smuggling operation. With the wiretap recording, Osa Rojas had everything she needed. She began the painstaking process of drafting the search warrants for Sterling's penthouse, his offices, and the transport company's warehouse. The legal paperwork had to be ironclad, anticipating every possible challenge from Sterling's high-powered legal team. Every I had to be dotted, every T crossed. The probable cause had to be so overwhelming that no judge could deny it. The fate of the entire case rested on the meticulousness of this final legal push. The night before the raid, the entire task force gathered in a briefing room. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and controlled tension. Photos of Sterling, his associates, and blueprints of the Onyx Tower covered the walls. Rojas and Evans laid out the plan of action, assigning roles and going over every contingency. Everyone in the room understood the significance of what they were about to do. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a statement. It was a message that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. As the meeting concluded, Frank's old sergeant, Davison, who had been looped in on the operation's logistics, pulled him aside. He looked at Frank with a new respect, but also with a lingering caution. "I was wrong about you, Miller," he admitted. Then he leaned in closer. "But listen to me. This warrant, this whole circus, it better not be based on a bruised ego. Because if this goes south, Sterling will own this entire department, the final reminder of the stakes, the final moment of pressure before the storm." Frank looked down at the search warrant in his hand. He saw his name listed as the initiating officer. It all came back to him: the cold rain, the marble lobby, Sterling's sneering face, and the insult that had started it all. He thought of his father, standing proudly in his uniform for 30 years. He thought of Carlos, risking everything for a sliver of justice. This was for them. This was for every person who had ever been made to feel small and invisible by men like Sterling. This was about more than just his ego. It was about balancing the scales. Riding in the back of the armored vehicle, as part of the convoy speeding through the pre-dawn streets of Chicago, Frank felt a profound calm settle over him. The fear and anxiety had been replaced by a sharp, focused sense of purpose. He was no longer just a beat cop. He was the author of a story that Sterling had unwittingly started. He was returning to the Onyx Tower not as a humiliated public servant, but as the instrument of a justice that Richard Sterling, in his monumental arrogance, had never even seen coming. The door he was about to close was not on a penthouse, but on an empire. The convoy of black, unmarked vehicles glided to a stop before the Onyx Tower, their engines cutting out to leave an eerie silence in the pre-dawn glow of the city. The streetlights cast long shadows as the federal task force disembarked, a swift and silent team clad in tactical gear, their movements precise and disciplined. Officer Frank Miller's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet of the morning. This was it, the culmination of sleepless nights, of risky choices, of a promise made to himself. As they moved towards the grand entrance, he saw the heavy brass door handle, the symbol of Sterling's impenetrable world. Tonight, they were not going to knock. They were going to kick it down, metaphorically, and, if necessary, literally. They breached the entrance with practiced efficiency, flooding into the cavernous marble lobby that had once been the stage for Miller's humiliation. The space, designed to awe and intimidate, was now a tactical zone. Agents fanned out, securing exits, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the opulent, sterile environment. At the doorman's station stood Carlos, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He saw Miller, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. In that silent exchange, a world of understanding passed between them, a shared risk, a silent partnership, and the dawn of a long-awaited justice. Miller gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a promise that Carlos's courage had not been in vain. Detective Evans, now firmly in command, directed a team towards the elevators. "Penthouse is the primary," he barked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Secure Sterling and all electronic devices." The agents moved with purpose, their boots squeaking softly on the polished marble. But just as the first team reached the elevator bank, a soft, melodic chime filled the air, the very same sound that had announced Sterling's arrival on that first night. The gold-leafed doors of the central elevator slid open silently, revealing Richard Sterling himself, dressed in expensive athletic wear, an irritated expression on his face, as he prepared for an early morning run along the lakefront. His annoyance at the commotion in his lobby quickly morphed into confusion, then into pure, undiluted rage as he took in the scene. He didn't see law enforcement executing a warrant. He saw peasants storming his castle. His eyes scanned the armed agents until they landed on Frank Miller. A flicker of contemptuous recognition crossed his face. His arrogance, so profound and absolute, left no room for fear. There was only the indignation of a king whose divine right had been challenged by a commoner. "What in the hell is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice radiating fury. "I'll have all of your badges. Get out of my building." He took a step forward, his chest puffed out, singling out the one person he deemed responsible for this outrage. He pointed a trembling finger at Miller. "You," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. The other residents, drawn from their apartments by the commotion, began to gather at a safe distance, a silent, wealthy audience for the unfolding drama. Sterling, playing to the crowd, let a cruel smirk spread across his face. He gestured dismissively at the armed agents. "Look who's back," he sneered at Miller. "Couldn't make it as a cop, so you brought friends. Did you come to get the door for me?" The insult was a desperate attempt to reassert his dominance, to put Miller back in his place. But the man standing before him was not the same officer he had humiliated weeks ago. Frank Miller stood his ground, his posture calm, his gaze unwavering. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid authority that came not from a badge, but from conviction. He was no longer a beat cop, haunted by his father's legacy. He was the embodiment of it. He let Sterling's words hang in the air and die, refusing to give them any power. He took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them, and the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, sensing the seismic shift in power that was about to occur. In his hand, Miller held not a weapon, but a folded sheaf of papers. He calmly unfolded it and held it up for the tycoon to see. "Richard Sterling," Miller announced, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "We have a federal warrant to search this building and your residence in connection with an ongoing investigation into felony money laundering and racketeering." The legalistic words, spoken with such professional finality, were a direct assault on Sterling's fortress of impunity. For the first time, A flicker of genuine uncertainty appeared in the billionaire's eyes, a crack in his armor of arrogance. Sterling scoffed, a harsh, guttural sound of disbelief. "A warrant?" He laughed, though the sound lacked any real mirth. "That piece of paper is worthless. It's the product of a pathetic little man with a bruised ego. My lawyers will have this thrown out by sunrise, and then they will begin the process of systematically destroying your career and your life." He was trying to bully his way out, using the only tools he knew: threats, money, and power. He looked past Miller to the gathering crowd of his neighbors, expecting their silent support, their shared belief that they were all above such sordid affairs. But the crowd remained silent, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. They were witnessing the unthinkable, one of their own being challenged, his power rendered meaningless by a simple piece of paper and the quiet determination of a man in a police uniform. This was a spectacle they had only ever read about, something that happened to other people, to lesser people. The hushed, reverent atmosphere of the Onyx Tower had been shattered, replaced by the raw, unpredictable theater of the law. And in the center of it all, Officer Frank Miller stood as the unwavering agent of that theater. Miller let the threats wash over him. He thought of Carlos, standing stiffly by the door, watching the man who had treated him like furniture for years finally face a consequence. He thought of his father, who had believed that a uniform was a symbol of service and responsibility, not of power and submission. This moment was for them. It was the culmination of a promise to honor a legacy of quiet dignity over loud-mouthed arrogance. This was the moment where the scales, so long tipped in Sterling's favor, would finally be balanced. The time for words was over. With a slow, deliberate movement, Miller reached for the handcuffs on his belt. The metallic click as he retrieved them was unnervingly loud in the silent lobby. The glint of the polished steel caught the light from the massive chandelier above, a small, brilliant flash in the dim morning light. A collective gasp went through the audience of residents. Handcuffs were a tangible symbol, a crude and undeniable instrument of subjugation that wealth was supposed to render obsolete. They were for criminals on television, not for men like Richard Sterling. Sterling's sneer finally faltered. He stared at the cuffs, and for the first time, a genuine expression of fear appeared on his face. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. This was not a negotiation. This was not a business deal he could bully his way through. This was the end of his reign. What do you think you're doing?" he stammered, his voice losing its thunderous authority, shrinking to a pathetic, defensive whine. He took an involuntary step back, but another agent had already moved to block his retreat. He was trapped. Miller stepped forward, closing the final gap between them. He looked Sterling directly in the eye, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the lobby, ensuring every witness heard the final verdict. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Sterling," Miller began, his tone even and devoid of malice. "You looked at this uniform and you saw a man who opens doors." He paused, letting the memory of the original insult hang in the air, allowing Sterling to remember his own words, his own hubris. Then, with a quiet authority that was more powerful than any shout, Miller delivered the line he had been waiting to say. The line that would redefine his uniform, his career, and his sense of self. "This uniform," he said, holding up the handcuffs, "isn't for opening doors for men like you. It's for closing them." An absolute, profound silence fell over the lobby. It was as if the city outside had ceased to exist. The air was thick with the weight of those words, a perfect, devastating reversal of power. The arrogant tycoon was speechless, his face a mask of utter shock and defeat. The residents, the agents, even Detective Evans stood frozen, captivated by the raw, poetic justice of the moment. The only sound that dared to break the spell was the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs as Frank Miller secured them around Richard Sterling's wrists. The click echoed through the marble hall, a sound as final and irrevocable as a judge's gavel. It was the sound of an empire crumbling, of arrogance being brought to its knees, of a debt finally being paid. Miller, his face impassive, took Sterling by the arm and began to lead him towards the main entrance, the very door Sterling believed Miller was only fit to open. As they passed the doorman's station, Miller saw Carlos. The older man's face was wet, a single tear of vindication and relief tracing a path down his weathered cheek. The cycle was complete. Justice, wearing a simple blue uniform, had come to the Onyx Tower. The raid on the Onyx Tower became the biggest story in Chicago overnight. News helicopters circled the building as a stunned and disheveled Richard Sterling was led out in handcuffs, his silk-running clothes a pathetic contrast to the cold steel on his wrists. The image was on every front page, every news channel. The media, hungry for a narrative, quickly latched onto the story of the quiet patrol officer who had brought down a titan. They called Miller the beat cop who toppled a king, a modern-day David against a corporate Goliath. The phrase Sterling had used as a weapon of humiliation, a doorman in a different uniform, was ironically twisted into a headline celebrating Miller as a hero of the working class, a symbol of integrity in a city often defined by its corruption. The evidence uncovered in the penthouse and the associated warehouse was overwhelming, painting a damning picture of a criminal enterprise hidden in plain sight. Federal agents found millions of dollars in treated currency, stuffed inside hollowed-out sculptures and abstract paintings. Detailed ledgers, encrypted on hidden hard drives, laid out the entire money laundering operation, linking Sterling directly to the Acosta cartel. His army of high-priced lawyers could do nothing against the mountain of irrefutable proof. Facing a massive RICO charge, Sterling's financial empire crumbled. His assets were frozen, his companies dismantled, and the Onyx Tower itself was seized by the federal government, a monument to the hubris of a man who thought he was untouchable. Weeks later, in a formal ceremony at police headquarters, Officer Frank Miller was awarded the department's highest commendation for investigative excellence. As the police superintendent pinned the medal on his chest, Frank saw Sergeant Davison in the front row, his face beaming with a pride that was both personal and professional. After the ceremony, his old sergeant shook his hand firmly. "You proved me wrong, Frank," Davison said, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me what this job is really about. It's not about avoiding trouble. It's about running towards it when you know it's the right thing to do." The public validation was gratifying, but this private acknowledgement from the man who had told him to stand down meant even more. The most significant reward, however, came not in the form of a medal, but an offer. Detective Evans, looking less rumpled and cynical than usual, approached Miller after the ceremony. "That desk I gave you in the task force office," Evans said with a rare smile. "It's permanent, if you want it. We're waiving the usual transfer protocols. You've already passed the toughest detective's exam I've ever seen. You have a home in financial crimes." It was everything Frank had been working towards for a decade. The detective's shield he had dreamed of was no longer a distant goal. It was a reality, earned not through seniority, but through courage, instinct, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Before starting his new position, Frank made one last visit to the Onyx Tower. The building was now managed by a federal receiver, its atmosphere less opulent and more subdued. He found Carlos at his usual post, but something was different. The doorman stood taller, the weary tension in his shoulders gone. He explained that the new management had reviewed the staff's employment records, given them all raises, and treated them with a respect Sterling had never shown. "They see us," Carlos said, a simple statement that carried the weight of a lifetime of being invisible. He looked at Frank, his eyes filled with a profound and quiet gratitude that no medal could ever match. He never saw the man, Carlos said, his voice soft but firm as he looked out through the glass doors at the bustling city. He only ever saw the uniform, and a uniform that wasn't as expensive as his own suit was beneath him. He didn't understand that a uniform means you serve something bigger than yourself. He turned back to Frank, extending a hand. "You serve the law. My father served his family. Your father served his guests. Thank you for showing him the difference." They shook hands, no longer a cop and a source, but two men bound by a shared understanding of dignity and service, two allies who had quietly righted a great wrong. Richard Sterling's trial was swift. Faced with the testimony of his own co-conspirators and the mountain of physical evidence, He was convicted on all counts. The judge, citing the breathtaking arrogance and scale of his crimes, sentenced him to 30 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. Stripped of his wealth, his power, and his freedom, he was now just a number in the system he once believed he controlled. The law, which he had viewed as a minor inconvenience for lesser people, had become the unyielding walls of his new, much smaller world. Justice, though it had taken a winding path, had been absolute. 6 months later, the transformation in Frank Miller was complete. Dressed in a well-fitted detective suit, he walked with a newfound confidence through the corridors of the federal building, a respected member of the city's most elite financial crimes unit. He was no longer just a beat cop. He was Detective Miller, a man whose name was synonymous with tenacity and integrity. The ghosts of self-doubt and professional insecurity were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He had not only solved a crime, he had discovered his own true worth, a value that had nothing to do with a pay grade or a title. Leaving the federal building late one evening, he passed the security desk and the young doorman standing by the main entrance. The young man, focused on his duties, barely looked up. Frank paused. He saw a flash of his own father, of Carlos, of a lifetime of service professions that are too often overlooked. He stopped and met the young man's surprised gaze. "Have a good night," Detective Miller said, his voice warm with genuine respect. The doorman straightened up, a small smile touching his lips. "You too, sir," he replied. It was a small gesture, a simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. As Frank Miller walked out into the cool Chicago night, the city lights seemed to shine a little brighter. He had learned that true authority is not wielded, but earned. It isn't found in the height of a skyscraper or the balance of a bank account, but in the quiet integrity of one's actions. His confrontation with Sterling had started with a personal insult, but it had ended with a universal truth that no one is above the law. In that respect, the simple act of seeing the person, and not just their station, is the bedrock of a just and compassionate society. He was a guardian of that principle now, in a suit or in a uniform. Do you believe true respect is earned through character, not status? Leave a little heart if you believe love and integrity are more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more stories where the underdog gets a second chance. Comment "Justice is priceless" if you also believe in the power of human kindness to change the world.